Chapter 7, Protein, Screencast 1. This is the last chapter in Unit 2, and this is the end of the energy-yielding molecules. The previous chapter, Chapter 6, one of the things I like to emphasize is how fat is actually demonized, and it really shouldn't be. Now we're moving on to protein, and protein is probably one of the most abused of the energy-yielding nutrients. There is a lot of misinformation out there about protein, and hopefully we'll address some of that in this particular chapter. Now, here when we're looking at the protein content in food, a couple of things to keep in mind. Animal-based proteins are always going to be pretty much the best source of protein, but let's not forget that there are a number of plant-based proteins. We have protein in other things also. So let's kind of take a look at where we find the majority of protein here. And if we look on this particular diagram, unsurprisingly, a lot of it is coming from animal products. So we see a lot in tuna, chicken, roast, all of those things. Then we look at dairy. But also, let's keep in mind that we are going to find a significant amount of protein in legumes, peanuts, and a lot of dairy. But let's not also forget that wheat can be a relatively good source of protein. And there are a number of other plant-based proteins that we'll talk about along the way. Now, when we look at the structure of proteins, one of the things that's going to distinguish protein from any of the other energy-yielding nutrients is going to be nitrogen. We will find, as usual, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but nitrogen, which is going to be found within the amino group, is something that we have not seen to date. We also might actually find sulfur in some of the proteins that are there. Now, what we need to remember here is the actual building block of proteins, and those are going to be amino acids. And when we look at amino acids, a couple of things to keep in mind. We will get them in our diet from protein-containing foods, but also keep in mind we have the capacity to produce and synthesize quite a few number of proteins. Now, when we look at the chemical structure of amino acids, this is really important. We're going to have a central carbon, and there also is going to be a group where the nitrogen is, and that is the amino group. Think of the N in amino to stand for the nitrogen. We're talking about amino acids, so there also has to be an acid group, and that's going to be the carboxyl group. Of course, as usual, we're going to have hydrogen, but what really is going to set amino acids apart is what we will refer to as the side chain or the R group. This will actually determine the structure, function, name, and really the identity of that particular amino acid. Now, if we look at the amino acid alphabet, there are a total of 20 amino acids that are necessary to function. We break them down into non-essential or dispensable, and there are 11 of those, and our body has the capacity to synthesize and produce these amino acids. They do not need to be obtained from the diet. The remaining 9 are considered to be essential, and you may see the term indispensable amino acids. They must come from our diet. We do not have the capacity to either synthesize within our body or produce them in the amount that's necessary to maintain homeostasis. And one thing to keep in mind here is why we can't synthesize them is because we cannot make the carbon skeleton, we're not able to attach an amino group to the carbon skeleton, or we don't have the capacity to produce them fast enough to meet the body's needs. But when we talk about proteins, and we will address this quite a bit, they're the most diverse of all of the energy-yielding nutrients. But let's go back to the building blocks. The amino acids, there's 20 of those. So let's think about the English alphabet that has 26 letters and compare that to our amino acid or protein alphabet, which has 20 separate amino acids. So just think about that. So this leads to the diversity of what we will see of the amino acids overall and proteins, really making them the most diverse of all of the energy-yielding nutrients. And we're also going to find that because of their diversity, they are going to be associated with a lot of functions. Yes, they are energy yielding, but that is not the main function of proteins. And that is a point that we will address pretty consistently within this chapter. Now, when we look at non-essential amino acids, they may be classified as conditionally essential. And that could be due to a number of conditions such as trauma, disease, or infancy. There is one particular disease known as phenylketonuria, or PKU, and this is characterized by a limited ability to metabolize phenylalanine and convert it to tyrosine. So now, because of this particular condition, tyrosine is now conditionally essential in this population. Now, when we look at the synthesis of non-essential amino acids, there are a couple words that you need to keep in mind, and they are indicative of processes involved in protein synthesis. We have transamination, think trans across, and this is going to be the transfer of an amino group from one amino acid to the carbon skeleton to form a new amino acid. And we can actually see that process here. If the amino group is lost and not transferred to another carbon, then we're going to refer to that process as deamination. And this amino group will actually be incorporated into urea in the liver, and it will actually be transported to the kidneys and excreted in urine. One thing to keep in mind here is because of the process of deamination and getting rid of that nitrogen group or the amino group, the byproduct is going to be ammonia. And that is why it has to be converted into urea, which is non-toxic and actually excreted through the kidneys. Now, the other thing we have to keep in mind here is how we characterize proteins, and you're going to hear the term complete versus incomplete. Animal proteins, except gelatin, will contain all 9 essential amino acids. These will be typically considered to be complete or high-quality proteins. Plant proteins, on the other hand, do not contain all 9 essential amino acids. Now, there are 2 exceptions here, and those are going to be quinoa and soy. And they tend to be, other than quinoa and soy, missing one of the or more of the essential amino acids. And so they will typically be classified as incomplete or low-quality protein. Now, another thing to keep in mind here is typically we're not really storing amino acids, and you're going to hear the term amino acid pool. And this is the pool of essential amino acids that is available within the body so that the body can actually synthesize proteins. And whenever we have the smallest amino acid that's essential in supply, that will be referred to as the limiting amino acid, because since it is essential and it is found in the lowest quantity, it will actually limit the amount of protein that a body can actually produce. Now, something that vegetarians have to do, and we'll talk about this in the final screencast, they do what is referred to as complementary. And what can happen is 2 or more plant proteins can be combined, and this actually compensates for deficiencies in essential amino acids. So you'll hear this term as complementary proteins. And there are some examples, and probably the example that you are most familiar with is red beans and rice. And this is going to be basically the limiting acid is lysine, but you can actually combine it with something like legumes, and you will actually get a complete protein for the most part. So this is a very common practice in vegetarians where they do this. And if we look at some examples of plant proteins, we have legumes, peanuts, dry beans such as navy, black, and kidney beans. Those will be exampled. They can actually be combined with grains, nuts, or seed. So kind of imagine an example would be hummus and whole wheat pita bread, a bean burrito. If we look at bean and barley stew, so that would be an example here. If we look at some others as far as a vegetarian chili with kidney beans and cashews, or sesame, buckwheat, and bean bread, but you're getting the idea. And you're not going to be responsible for identifying the actual limiting acids and how we actually get to a more complete protein through the complementary process. But just an understanding of this particular concept is going to be important.